welcome back to On the Mind. I'm Austin.
I'm Bryce.
I'm Duncan.
And today we're going to be talking about Trump's budget wish list, basically. It's an overview that he sends out and puts his name on that says, this is what I want done. And to talk about the overview, which is what we're going to do first, here's Duncan Ryan.
Okay, so the budget blueprint is effectively a preview of what's going to be in the budget. Even though it is not the complete budget, it does have significant numerical meaning as far as what occurs on the discretionary spending. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with either mandatory spending, which the executive branch doesn't have a lot of lateral room on to move on, and it doesn't have anything to do with tax revenues. So, with that said, here is basically what the budget looked like. Even though it did decrease spending by a very tiny amount, the primary goal of the budget...
Bryce, how much was that?
1.2%.
Yes, yeah. So even though it did decrease spending nominally, the primary goal of the budget was actually to balance substantial increases in what Trump described as national security spending, which is to say a $54 billion increase in the total military spending and also substantial increases meant to pay for border security, which included both some funding for basically the preliminary parts of building the Great Border Wall, and more importantly and more substantially in terms of the budget, hiring several hundred more, actually perhaps several thousand more INS agents and border security patrol troops.
Okay, and what are the implications as far as the entire overview? Other than that narrow view, what else did the Department of Defense get from that $54 billion?
Well, now that's actually difficult to say because, again, this was all earmarked as national security spending. And again, in the budget blueprint, we don't see a whole lot of the details as to precisely what this is going to pay for. And again, this is exclusively discretionary spending. Now, one thing I would like to briefly touch on while we're talking about the implications of the budget overall is that this is not in any way, this is Trump effectively saying, I am not a fiscal conservative. If he had tweeted this, it could not have been more clear because he did nothing to actually cut spending in the areas where spending is most inefficient. And in fact, in one of the three areas where it's most inefficient, he actually raised spending, and that's the defense budget.
What I was going to say is, you mentioned this before the podcast, he didn't hit any of the low-hanging fruit.
No, he left Social Security and Medicare completely unaffected. He did make some nominal cuts in programs that ultimately take up, $50 million here, $100 million there. And, these sound like huge numbers, but in terms of our national budget, really quite insignificant. Effectively, this was a fairly liberal budget packaged to make it somewhat palatable to real conservatives.
All right, I think we need to talk about Social Security on a different episode, so I'm going to leave that one alone, just because I think we can have fun with it. So is the Department of Defense it's the only one that got any real increase?
Effectively, yes. Now, Homeland Security is going to see some increases. Again, this is mostly to do with the border security, that sort of thing. But in terms of the most drastic increase, that's what we're seeing in defense. Now, we also saw several cuts in other departments, specifically education was one of the more hard hit. The Environmental Protection Agency, of course, as we were discussing before the show,
was the hardest hit. We'll get to that. Let's go ahead and talk about the Department of Defense. Do you want to leave that off?
Yes, absolutely. You guys know I really love to talk about this stuff. So, to the viewers out here, if you've seen all of our videos, and this is old news to you, and it's certainly old news to these two guys next to me. So in 2015 alone, the Pentagon had a $601 billion budget, and that encompasses defense, homeland security, and veterans affairs, all sort of lump sum together. That is more than the next 7 countries combined. Of course, in that year alone, the Pentagon...
Do you know how many of those 7 countries are our allies?
I do not. I know China's number 2.
I guess they're technically an ally?
Sort of, in a sense.
Have a treaty with them.
Sort of, in a sense. I would think that probably Britain and France are both on there, both being also members of the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Right. Okay, just keep going.
Okay. Well, of course, that year, 2015, the Pentagon also overspent by $6.54 trillion. Every year, the Pentagon is required to adhere to an audit. That law has been in effect for the last 21 years, and each year the Pentagon has said, we're not exactly ready. We don't have our receipts in order, and they have not once been audited. Anyway, my point is that we spend way too much, like Duncan said. It's just unfeasible why we spend so much on something that's so useless. I mean, we just got out of 2 wars. For Pete's sake, why do we need to spend, how much was it, $54 billion more?
Well, that's an additional beyond what the budget of last year was.
All right, and just go ahead and pause that train of thought. I'll let you get back to it. As a fiscal conservative, does it make your blood boil that they won't allow themselves to be audited?
It does. Now, there are obviously circumstances in which government entities, especially ones with very large spending, will not always be ready exactly on time. However, that is a huge problem when it comes to our budget. And this is actually a problem that's being exacerbated by this $54 billion increase. And that's the inefficiency of both the procurement process for military wares and also just the inefficiency of the military systems in general, the bureaucracy that's involved in it, some of the benefit systems that are involved in it. There's sort of, and we've talked about this on the show before, there's what I like to call the cult of the American soldier, where people are unsatisfied if they end up spending less for precisely the same thing, because it's almost a psychological difference between we're spending, $25 billion and we get this, versus spending $35 billion to get exactly the same thing. Somehow in some people's minds, and especially when politicians present it, the $35 billion price tag means we care more about our troops, even though it has no objective differences whatsoever.
Want to keep going, Bryce?
No, I have a little bit more I wanted to say about Hillary Clinton and how how I would speculate her budget would look, but we can get back to that later.
Yeah, as far as being a war hawk goes, she's one of the top in Washington, from what I remember. So.
Yeah, not necessarily even just defense alone, but it's just sort of an overview of the whole, of what I imagine her.
I imagine her budget would have been... It would have given Duncan an aneurysm.
Well, here, let me just get into it real quick. It'll take about 20 seconds.
Okay, sure.
So I imagine, Trump has cut a lot of programs and he's raised only defense. I believe that Clinton would raise defense, raise all of the other programs that Trump decided to cut, except for the EPA, because we all know that Hillary Clinton is a lizard person, and lizard people really want global warming because then they will thrive better.
I got to cut you off.
Dominant race.
I promised myself I wouldn't let you.
Earth.
I wouldn't let you go down this path.
Just
awesome.
kidding.
Awesome. We've gone full on David Icke.
Yeah, we're past Alex Jones at this point. That's good to know.
Just for the record, we all know that lizard people are not real.
So I'm actually going to kind of go on that for a moment, because as much as I disagreed with Hillary Clinton's economic policies, I have to give her one thing that I do not have to give Trump. She specifically enumerated in her platform several times major spending increases. Obviously, I did not agree with those. However, she also enumerated substantial tax increases to pay for them. I didn't agree with those either.
There you go.
But at least Hillary Clinton's deficit in the budget was something along the lines of about $200 billion, not all that substantial.
For our national budget.
Correct.
If that hit a certain state, that'd be disastrous. But for all of our states...
Absolutely. But the point here is that, for all of its faults, even her budget and tax plan was more balanced than Donald Trump's. And it takes a lot to get me to say that I like a Democrat's budget better than a Republican's. It's been done, apparently.
At least she understood that you need to tax more to spend more.
And that's something else. You want to go on your little Donald Trump's the most liberal president we've ever had rant?
I would love to.
Go ahead. Why don't you do that?
So in terms of leftist presidents, Donald Trump is about as bad as we've ever had, with the possible exception of Lyndon Baines Johnson. The reason I say that is this. Rather than actually adhering to the rules of fiscal conservatism, as previous Republican presidents typically have done, Trump's entire position is a massive misinterpretation of Keynesian economic policies. In his book, you cut taxes, you cut regulations, and that does fuel economic growth. That's an objective reality. But the problem is that his plan is to simultaneously spend more to subsidize that growth. And what you end up with when you actually pursue that policy is a situation in which the budget deficits and the overall national sovereign debt grow to such extremes that during the next downturn, we're not obviously going to be able to cut that spending back, because it'll be needed to some degree. But then the next upturn, we're left with such a remarkable amount of debt and such huge budget deficits and such entrenched welfare programs and spending programs that there will effectively be no way out of it.
And it's kind of insane that we agree on this, because you just effectively prescribe to Keynesian economics.
I'm saying if you're going to follow that, then the one thing you do not do is cut spending during an economic downturn.
Right.
And you also do not increase spending during an economic upturn.
You know what, Duncan? I think we need to do a debate on that sometime. Is your
Keynesian economics
versus your conservative economics.
Okay, I think we can do that.
All right, so Bryce, you have anything to say?
No, that was, I mean, I can talk more about other stuff, but that was...
All right, no lizard people, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Don't be Alex Jones.
I'll try my best. I'll try my best to not bring up lizard people or to be Alex Jones.
Please
To be fair, he hasn't yelled.
Please don't gain 50 pounds, go partially bald, and yell.
Clinton is a demon from hell, and goddamn her!
Well, at least he didn't say Obama. I'd agree with you at this point. All right. So we've talked about his increases. Let's talk about all the low-hanging fruit he didn't hit before he hit the ones that weren't low-hanging fruit that he did hit. So, Duncan, go ahead, because I know this is a special place in your heart.
Yeah, so the one thing that Donald Trump really could have done to sort of advance fiscal conservatism in this budget is limit some of the discretionary spending on Social Security and Medicare. Now, before we get into this, let's recognize in some fairness to him that most of that spending is mandatory spending. It doesn't really have much wiggle room in terms of the executive budget that needs to be accomplished by legislation.
And can I please go ahead and say that Social Security is supposed to be its own thing, and that government entanglement in it is contrary to the program's best interest. It was supposed to be left alone and be the safety net.
By the same token, even the most liberal of think tanks at this point will recognize that it has some substantial economic flaws, and a lot of that is to do with the way the world has changed since its inception.
Right. It was
people live longer, people work longer.
Absolutely, and that's not the problem. The problem is, how much does the government owe Social Security at this point?
Precisely.
We've dipped our hands into that, and now you see that retired people aren't able to spend as much because they aren't getting the benefits that they were basically guaranteed when they paid into the program. So what it basically turns into is that politicians have, and correct me if I'm wrong, in essence stolen from what these people paid into. They basically took it as tax revenue instead of benefits that were paid for.
Maybe, now I will say not from a legal perspective. From the legal perspective, that's not actually valid because that money does come in through payroll taxes or FICA taxes and is treated as part of the discretionary budget.
Fair enough, but that was never the intent of the program. If it needed to be worded differently, that's fine. But we all knew that it was supposed to be the end-all, be-all basic retirement plan for Americans.
So, but be that as it may, I feel like, again, this is probably its own debate. Trump not doing anything in terms of paring back the spending on Social Security and Medicare while increasing the defense budget and going after all of these extremely small programs that, granted, you can argue about whether they were really accomplishing very much or not. Again, it really just announced the fact that, hello, I am Donald Trump, and I am not a fiscal conservative. I have no interest in the traditional precepts of fiscal conservatism. I have no actual interest in cutting this back.
And I think that's another episode in its own that maybe even just the two of us could go into is there's a difference between a fiscal conservative and a social conservative. And the fact that they're both in the same party just kind of makes your brain a little fuzzy sometimes.
not only our brains, but in many cases the brains of the two various types of conservatives as well. They do not rub along well together in many
And you
cases.
know what? With the rise of different caucuses, such as the Freedom Party caucus, I think is a symptom of that.
Absolutely.
I always thought it was funny that people who refer to themselves as, the liberals or the far left, while economically they may be such as that, socially speaking, they're all about keeping government out of people's personal choices, such as when it comes to abortion or, say, even transsexual.
Well, you know
like
what? A true conservative, looking at the past, a true conservative would say the government has no right to look at your private.
The way you live your life is
It has
absolutely...
absolutely nothing to do with.
Provided that it does not actively harm another person, the way you live your life is not the purview of government.
And to have Republicans say, well, we don't like trans rights, we don't like gay rights, and we're going to tell women that abortions are illegal. What does that have to do with the government? Absolutely nothing.
Right.
Another thing that, I don't know, this could almost go either way. The bill that was just passed on internet security or lack thereof.
My God.
I mean, you could say that maybe internet companies have a right to that information, or you could say that...
Absolutely not, and I'll tell you why.
I agree with you. Absolutely not.
I can bust that one simple argument. When you look at information being transmitted on the internet, it's even called packets. If you don't know that, information being sent is called a packet. So these packets, in essence, are basically kind of like information that you'd send in mail. Correct me if I'm wrong. So when you send that, you have that expectation of confidentiality that you'd have with the mail system. So when the Senate, in this case, says, no, they can look at your mail and give the contents to whoever they want for a price, that to me is more or less illegal.
My one and only concern with this is, and it's actually a concern that something that's already been done was the wrong direction to go, because I think your argument is pretty sound there, Austin. I do see some degree of validity in the internet providers saying, look, Facebook and Comcast, or Facebook and Google and all these companies already do this, and there are two different sets of rules for us and for them. I do think that's not particular. I do think there should just be a single set of rules. But I think that the one we're moving toward is the wrong set.
Mm-hmm. I believe privacy is the American citizen's most treasured right.
Right. Be it, now, let's be clear about this, though. Be it privacy from an individual, a private entity, or the government. That's something we've all discussed substantially before.
Well, you know what? I'm going to look at it this way. If you look at the government, I'm sure you're not going to be able to tell what's going on, which is contrary to what the Founding Fathers had in mind. Then you look at what they're allowing to happen to private citizens, it's abysmal, truly.
Right. Well, I mean, let's look at, say, the NSA's metadata collection program. That really was not substantially different from now what internet service providers are legally allowed to keep on you.
You know what? I think this is something that the three of us agree on, actually. And this is kind of the driving point behind Bryce and I's argument against private companies being able to do whatever they want with what your confidentiality, basically, your privacy. And I think we all can appreciate that we have privacy.
Correct.
We all appreciate that it's kind of a right that we have, and the Senate just said your privacy means nothing, and these companies are going to jump on that for profit, and that's what we have issue with.
Now, I will point out, in counter to that there is now an open market niche for an internet service provider that specifically says, as a contractual agreement, we will not collect and we will not sell your information. And that now has more value in the marketplace, and again, competitive market forces can act over time to solve that problem.
Then I think that's another thing is Bryce and I would argue, correct me if I'm wrong, Bryce, that would take quite a while, and the exploitation in that time period would be quite harmful.
I absolutely agree. Say hypothetically, Google and Yahoo were selling this information, which I'm sure
they already are.
Google is.
They do. They already do.
That's why you get targeted ads.
And
That's why you do get targeted ads if you're not sure.
So anyway, it would be nearly impossible, not impossible, but nearly impossible for a smaller company to be able to eventually compete with these very large companies.
On the other hand, with that competitive edge, the value of their service goes up substantially. So, Bryce, as a customer, would you not pay more for a company that you knew was specifically not going to collect or sell your information than you would for a company that you had reasonable expectation would? The profit margin goes up at that point.
What we're saying is these rules disproportionately affect the less fortunate.
Yes, that as well. I mean, how many poor college students use the internet for, nearly all of their homework assignments?
I actually don't know that number. I don't even know any percentages.
I would say that the income actually doesn't matter. If you're a college student, be you either a former member of the Newport 400 or someone who's there on a Pell Grant, you have to use the internet. I mean, the income thing does not really have anything to do with it.
Well, that's what I mean is that then that information will be sold online, and if you're a poorer person, then
and let me before I let you go further, this is something I think you're going to agree with me with. They allowed the transmission of financial information to third-party buyers.
Correct, and that gets into. My guess is that's actually going to be challenged in the courts before very long if this actually does go into effect. And I would be willing to bet
the damage will be done.
It will be done. I would be willing to bet the courts will strike that down.
But that's the problem is, even though it's an imperfect process and this is how it's supposed to be, the damage will be done and many people will be affected. But before we get off topic, let's move on to the next department.
Well past.
We are way off topic.
That's fair. That's fair.
We apologize for our rambling, you people who are not listening anymore. You.
Let's talk about some. You know what, Bryce? Why don't you go ahead and take the lead on this one?
Whoa, what?
Which departments do you think are getting hit hardest for the least amount of reason?
EPA.
All right, talk to me about why. That's 31%, and that's the hardest hit department that's getting cut.
Yes. Well, I mean, none of us were really surprised. If you were surprised, shame on you. Trump nominated, and the Senate picked the EPA-hating head of the EPA, whose name escapes me. Duncan, do you?
Actually, it's bouncing off of my head at the moment as well.
His name's not important. But, that's getting hit the hardest. As we all know, Trump believes in such a thing as clean coal, and that global warming was a lie created by the Chinese to slow down American business, such and such. And so here we have it, the, in my opinion, very important government function, which is Environmental Protection Agency, that is seeing a 31% decrease in funding.
And I'll say this, even as a fiscal conservative, I see a lot of benefit in the EPA, specifically as it relates to property protection for people whose private property is impacted by actions that occur on other people's private property. I see a lot of benefit from that standpoint. My problem with the entirety of these cuts, and I do think there needed to be not even necessarily budget cuts, but there do need to be some regulatory reviews on the EPA. We all were, I think, sufficiently kind of disgusted about last year, maybe 2 years ago, when the EPA ruled that ditches that fill up in a rainstorm are native waterways, and that gave them regulatory authority over them. I think we can all agree that was definitely overstepping their bounds.
We see overreach as kind of a negative thing for not just the economy, but for the
rights of the individual.
Yeah,
right. So I think that the problem with this is that now that we have someone who's just blindly making budget cuts and not doing this, my projection of what's going to happen in the future is the next time we have a Democratic president, there's going to be so much focus on quote-unquote restoring the EPA that not only is its budget going to go through the roof, maybe to a point that it does not even actually need, but the actual review that needs to occur on some of its overreaches is going to be completely tabled. It's not even going to be undertaken.
It's just a bunch of rubber band effects.
I think that this has delegitimized the actual concerns about the role of the EPA, or rather the role the EPA has carved out for itself, and just turned it into something of a farce.
Right. We and this, I think, goes back further than just Democrats and Republicans, but voting along party lines kind of incentivizes that.
To some degree, especially when the person who's heading your party and,
Paul Ryan. Oh,
Well, now, here's the thing. A sitting president is the head of his party, whether it's an official title or not. The sitting president is the head of his party. And when a sitting president takes these sort of extreme views, often informed by conspiracy theorists and people who, for lack of a better word, have no clue what they're actually talking about when it comes to global warming and that sort of thing.
When they're on a news channel, they're called experts.
Say, can we get on a news channel?
I'm sure Bryce could, since he mentioned lizard people.
You could be a guest for Alex Jones.
Yes.
There you go. Just to be warned, he has mentioned on his show before that many of his guests get targeted and die.
I wonder.
From Obama and Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, they target their guests.
But no, my real concern is that this just delegitimizes actual concerns about the role of the EPA, and that's going to carry on into future election, and that this is going to be a hot button issue for the next Democrat to run against Trump, or perhaps the next Democrat to run in 2024.
Jill Stein 2020.
Allow me to shoot myself in the head.
We all know it's going to be Elizabeth Warren, whether we want to admit it or not.
Allow me to get drunk.
There you go. Well, we have plenty of beer. So
not enough for that.
Well, we've got plenty of bars within walking distance.
Not enough for that.
We can try. Let's see. Let's talk about some of the programs that are going to get hit. For me, as a parent of a young child, PBS is going to be a godsend. My child already loves Sesame Street. She really does. She already knows who Elmo is, to my chagrin. And she loves to follow his adventures in a certain hotel. It's something about being fuzzy. I don't remember. Woolsworth. Anyway, so to see that, and they just did an episode where Elmo discovers that he's been laid off. And I thought that was kind of fitting, because he's supposed to have the mind of a child, and how do you tell a child that he doesn't get to go to work anymore? So when you have that concept in your head, you see this as a children basically being told you're not allowed to learn the basics anymore. And Duncan and I know you and I disagree on this to a certain extent, but when I see some parents aren't willing to teach their children even the basics, Sesame Street comes in there and fills that gap. And for that to be nationally the basic core for people to say, okay, you know what letters are, you know what numbers are, for you to say, okay, that's what I want. Personally, as a father, that's what I want my child to have, is the basics, ABCs, 1, 2, 3s. That's what I want her to have. I want her to know all of that. And for President Trump to come in here and say, I'm going to cut that few million out and give a couple billion to the Defense Department, it just seems like he's taking drops from low-income families. And I know there are plenty of cuts that he made that aren't just towards low-income individuals, but he seems to take the, especially educational ones, and just cut them without second thought to increase the Department of Defense.
Right, and again, you've kind of hit on where my opposition to this lies. I actually don't particularly think that things like National Public Radio, National Public Television, or the National Endowment for the Arts should be funded by the government, but I consider those very high-hanging fruits. In other words, those are the last things that should be gone after because, as you correctly point out, it's a few $1 million. In our national budget, that's barely anything. But when you're leaving the most inefficient places that we spend money completely alone, or in the case of the Department of Defense, even worse, allowing for that incredibly inefficient procurement process to simply endure with an extra $50+ billion worth of spending, I find it incredibly hard to actually justify that, because you're not cutting spending per se. All you're doing is moving it around.
If I may, take a trip down memory lane a little bit. Not all the way back to my Omo days, but back, about 5 years ago, Mitt Romney suggested cutting PBS, and everyone was so sad about Sesame Street, and everybody lost their minds, and they're like, no, Mitt Romney, absolutely not. And now Trump's actually doing it, and I mean, it's pretty much just like us three that are upset about, well, us two that are upset about it.
I want to no, Duncan. He agrees with me that at least at the basic terms that this shouldn't have been the first cut.
No. In fact, I wouldn't even call this tier 2, 3, maybe even tier 4 as far as cuts in the federal government.
And don't get me wrong, as a Keynesian economist, I believe that eventually all public spending should be zero if the economy is perfect and everything's being met to the demand that it has. However, we're not even close to that. So for me to say this should be the first cut, I'd consider myself insane almost.
No, I find it impossible to say that this should have been a first cut under any formal set of economic or philosophical positions that I am aware of that have traditionally informed political decision making in Western civilization.
Fair enough. But yeah, we've covered PBS pretty much as I'd like to. I think that's a horrible cut.
Real quick, while we're still on the Department of Education, there's another one I'd like to bring up that has raised quite a bit of controversy, which is the cutting of after-school program, after and before school program funding, I should say.
And I find the argument for those cuts to be kind of lacking. I think that it increases worker productivity to the point where it's okay.
Wait, how so?
What do you mean? I feel like kids being in those after-school programs relieves the stress on the parents.
Yes, okay.
Not only that, but it teaches them work ethic, blah, blah, blah. It gives them a place to grow, if nothing else. So when you say, hey, I want to take away that extra learning opportunity for children, I want to put more stress on working families. Because when you look at it, if schools do nothing else, they're babysitters. Am I wrong, Duncan?
No, actually, that is the first and perhaps most important role of a school, is to get children out of their parents' hair for 8 hours a day.
Exactly, so they have that full workday. And whether you agree with that or not, that's how most parents view it.
One might actually argue that that's also where schools are most economically beneficial, as strange as that may sound.
It really is. And when you continue to cut schools or pay teachers as low as they've been paid traditionally, I think it's around $30,000 give or take in most states.
It depends heavily on both the state and the school as well.
Right, and on tenure. There
are a wide range of factors that play into it.
Right, and we can get into that on a separate episode if we'd wish, but I don't think that I know enough about it. However, when you look at that, you say, okay, not only is it quote-unquote a daycare, even for high school students, it's a place where they can, if they want to, learn valuable skills for life. It's somewhere they can excel, that they can build a career off of. When you say, hey, I want to cut that, it makes me scratch my head a little bit, even if it's as inefficient as it is in our country.
Right. And again, I might make the argument for the before and after school programs not being federally funded, but being kicked back either to the state or the local level, because I think that's a better, for non-core curriculum, I do think that's probably a better way to allocate the resources. But again, the same argument as before applies, where the cost of these programs was relative to the inefficiencies in our federal spending systems so low that these were incredibly high-hanging fruit. There was no point in making this part of the first round of cuts and leaving everything else that's wrong in play.
Okay, so I want to touch on the fact that most of Trump's cuts are going to affect people that voted for him in rural areas.
Yeah.
Well, that's the most ironic thing I think I've ever heard in my entire life.
Right, and you read stories about people talking about it all the time. There's one woman that married a Mexican man that agree that illegal immigrants committing crime is a bad thing, and then her husband's getting deported now.
Right. Now, this kind of becomes a little bit difficult to evaluate, if only because if you are actually a fiscal conservative, you should be willing to take those cuts, to shoulder the responsibility personally in order to have a more fiscally conservative and a more lean government. However, I think what we're discovering rapidly now is that a lot of the people who voted for Trump were only fiscal conservatives as long as it did not impact them personally.
And you know what? I've seen that a lot when it comes to Republicans, is they'll agree with anything as long as it doesn't personally affect them when it comes to cuts.
I'm going to disagree a little bit. I think that these people are not smart enough to realize what they actually want is not fiscally conservative.
You know what? Maybe that's correct, but as far as it goes, I feel as long as they're disaffected, they don't care enough, is what it boils down to.
Okay, so
because when it affects you, you become informed on the subject, more or less.
I mean, nothing about that woman's husband being deported would teach her that deporting illegal immigrants doesn't really have that positive of an impact on the economy.
Well, for one, she was married to him, so I kind of wondered why he's not already given U.S. citizenship. Isn't that how it works?
If he is an illegal who was in the country and then married her, and they did not register that marriage properly, that doesn't count. You actually have to register the marriage, and he has to come in through the proper channels in order for that to work. If they just got married after he was already in the country, then that nullifies that.
And you know what? That boils down to we need to work on immigration reform. It's obvious that our systems are outdated. However, let's focus back on the budget. Let's just talk about our takeaways. Duncan, why don't you start?
Well, my takeaway from this was, for a very brief period of time, I was taking some hope that perhaps Donald Trump would turn out to not be a fiscal conservative, but perhaps be influenced by some fiscal conservatives in Washington to maybe take more moderate positions. He not withdrew, but at least stopped talking about the ideas of heavy tariffs on foreign imports. He kind of stopped going on the crazier ideas he had with NAFTA. And the fact of the matter is that this budget just cinched it for me that Trump is, as I've said before, one of the most leftist presidents we've ever had. He's not interested in actually cutting the deficit. He's not interested in more efficient spending. I think Trump could not have possibly made clearer that he is not only not a fiscal conservative, but has no interest in even trying to be one.
All right. I have... this is closing statements?
Yes.
Okay, I have 2 sentences. First one is, goodbye environment. It was nice knowing you. The second sentence is, Red Lives Matter, or I guess it'd be semicolon, keep Elmo.
All right. I guess my takeaway is Trump tried to appear conservative by making cuts. I think he made cuts in all the wrong places. Not only that, he raised spending in unnecessary places, which is not conservative at all. So while we have the debt that we have, I would say that his attempt to be conservative falls flat on its face. And I desperately hope that he doesn't get what he wants for tax reform until not only our budget balances, but our deficit becomes manageable. So anyway, that's all that's on the mind. Thanks for listening. And if you liked it, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, there's a comment section below. We are willing to talk to you. Thank you.